All right, and I'm going to introduce our presenters at this time. So here we have Worship Pastor Ellie Boersma and Senior Pastor Bob Lortz. They have been working together at Covenant CRC at St. Catharines, Ontario for about 4.5 years. Bob is the senior pastor and the minister of the word, and part of his role is overseeing staff. And Ellie is the pastor of worship. She's a commissioned pastor, and she's full-time at the church. Church structure itself is council-led and staff-supported. So as staff, they carry out the vision for the church as mandated by the council and are also answerable to the council. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Ellie and Bob. Take it away.
Go ahead, Ellie.
All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ellie Boersma, and I am, as Diane said, I'm the pastor of worship here at Covenant Christian Reformed Church. We're in St. Catharines, Ontario. Just for a bit of geographical context, that's kind of halfway between Toronto and Niagara Falls. So we're right on Lake Ontario in wine country and grape country. So that's our geographical location. I'm full-time here as the worship pastor. And so we do get a lot of communication back and forth with each other. So that's sort of what frames up our conversation here is our perspective, but we also hope that this webinar will give some practical take-home principles, even for those who are working with maybe a part-time staff or even volunteers. I think a lot of these principles can go across the board that way as well.
And my name is Bob, and I've been pastor in ministry for about 20 years. This is the third congregation that I've led and pastored, and this is the second church where there's been staff, but the first time where the other staff members are full-time staff. So it's been just a treat getting to see how everyone works together and just encouraging the collaboration that happens there. A lot of things that Ellie and I have been talking about in framing up the understanding of how we work together. One of the big things we really wanted to talk to the group today was about how important collaboration was. That from the beginning of everything that we do together, it's always about collaboration. How do we work together? How do we pull this together? The brainstorming ideas that we just begin by doing all that kind of work together. And then when it comes to actually implementing a lot of stuff, we've come to know each other well enough that we work with each other's strengths and say, these are the things that I see you really good at, or these are the kinds of things that, and we don't even have to say it anymore because we've been working together for over 4 years. That saying, I see that when it comes to choosing a song, I don't choose them because I can't read music and I have many other limitations. And that's the other side with the limitations, is you get to know each other well enough to say, you're really good at that, and I'm going to follow your lead on that, and that's where your leadership takes in. And that's where I'm limited. And if I'm limited, it's best for me to take that position of being, I guess humility is a key on that, but also just a willingness to be able to say, I can't know everything and I can't be an expert in everything. So I have to rely on others to do that kind of work. Anything you want to add to that, Ellie?
I think too, one of the benefits that I had was in getting part of my education was actually at Calvin Seminary. And so I did the Masters of Arts program in worship there. And a lot of that you're in classes with MDiv students, so people who are looking to become pastors of churches. And yeah, musicians and pastors are both quirky people, but often in different ways. And so Bob's shaking his head. It's the truth, I promise. And so even just, experiencing school alongside with them, but also getting to know and learning how to interact with each other, I think was very helpful for me. And also even just studying in classes under Howie Vanderwell and Norma DeWall-Malafite. And the two of them have been working in ministry for a long time. And I always saw that relationship and thought, that's what I want in a church. And so even when I was pursuing which positions to look for me, it was a big thing to find a church that I could fit with, but also a pastor relationship that would really be life-giving and productive in working together, as much as is humanly possible. And even just learning how to speak each other's language. We may not understand it all the time, but there are ways that music and theology really intertwine together. And I think the more we understand each other's sides of things, the deeper we can understand worship together.
So when it gets into the question of how we do the various planning and such, I want to take the part about macro planning, the big picture, and then Ellie will get a little bit into the micro planning of actually putting services together. So when we start talking about, for instance, there's a season coming up of Lent, and we've already done our planning on that. We've planned out all of Lent. What happens is sometimes the pastor can come in from on high and say, here's what the Lord has opened up to me that I have to preach through the season of Lent. And that's not my approach. My approach is to say, let's sit down together and talk together. And part of that is the assumption that our other pastor on staff, Pastor Kevin Vanderveen and Pastor Ali, the three of us sit together and we say, okay, what are we hearing? What are we seeing? What are we seeing in the congregation as a whole? Some of that comes out in elders meetings as well, where we have some of those conversations with our elders as what are you seeing as a growth that's needed in our congregation. And then we sit together already in the brainstorming that the three of us sit together and say, which way do we want to go? Do we, for instance, when we talked about the Lent series, one of the things we talked about was, okay, do we want to do the 7 last words of Christ on the cross and work through a series on that? And actually where we landed was we had been reading the new book from Fleming Rutledge and on the crucifixion, and said there is such good material here that we want to now develop a sermon series out of that. And that works all together, and where Ellie's bringing in saying, okay, what kind of visuals do we want to use? What kind of themes do we want to have through those services, and how do we work it through? So that's a big part of that. Some of the principles, and there's 4 that I've written down here. The first is, when it comes to macro planning, is clarity. Does everybody understand exactly what's going on? The second part of it is timeliness. Are we doing this that everybody has enough lead time to be able to step into it, to say, they're not scrambling at the last minute to say, okay, what kind of images, but they have the time to plan through for that. The third principle is trust. That we have worked hard as staff to say, how do we trust one another to say, this is the idea, this is the general, and we'll talk about it really, and often it's even just in vague terms that we're kind of catching each other. But, and then what happens is we each go off to do our little piece, and then we come back again to say, how does that pull together? And there's a lot of trust to say, I trust that what Ellie's going to pull together is going to fit exactly with the themes that we've been talking about. And the last, of course, is responsibility, that each of us, no matter who it is responsible for what our piece is in the whole. And that just helps us to really work well together, that everybody knows their part, everybody understands that, and we're all on the same page. That's macro.
Yeah, and I think to kind of tie into that too is this open communication that is there at all time. And we talked about this a little earlier too. So that even along in that process of development, that if there's a question about something, or if there's I'm kind of going in this direction, is that the right way? Is that how you've been thinking about this? And just having those conversations along the way as well. And two, that how like timeliness is going to vary depending on your situation as well. So if you're a church that uses a choir regularly, that congregation you may need more lead time for a worship planner in that setting, because it will take longer for a choir to learn a piece than it would for maybe a praise team to figure something out in a week. So that's also a conversation to have between the pastor and the worship planner, is what do you need as far as timeliness goes. So then going into service planning and a little bit more of that micro planning. So this is sort of where I take this whole theme and idea and the scripture texts that have been laid out. And usually I just start with study that scripture, the scripture passage for each week, reading up on it, finding keywords and themes that are jumping out at me, maybe other associated scripture passages that could be pulled in. During an internship, I had a pastor who said, I don't need you to re-preach the sermon. And so part of it too is we do a lot of thematic services, so that a service will follow a specific theme, but you also want to help develop that theme a little bit and not just say the same words repeatedly throughout the service. So part of what I do too is trying to figure out how to use other language to fully develop the theme. And so quite often I'll go to the Psalms as well, because the Psalms just sing well. That's one of the reasons why I do that, and it helps to give some of that language that I might want to pull in other places. And then from there, I just come up with a massive list of songs to pull from, and so a lot of my planning just starts with massive brainstorming, and then you sort of see patterns and things that will take shape from there. And again, if there's a direction that I'm going in when I read the scripture and study up on that, I'll quite often go back to Bob and ask too, is this sort of where you're landing, or have I totally misunderstood, or what are you reading about it? So having those constant conversations. And then too, thinking along the lines of what in the passage is giving us cause for praise or cause for confession, cause for lament. And so yeah, incorporating all of that. The other big part of working alongside of the pastor is your pastor is the one who does a lot of the visiting. And so it's easier to plan for a congregation that you know, and it's very difficult for you to know everybody if you're not actually the one going and doing a lot of the visits and all of that. So having a good grasp on what the congregation is going through, I think helps to really shape a lot of those service plans as well. Because I might have an idea of what will speak to them, but if it's not hitting them where they're at, you don't want to be out of touch with what your congregation is going through. And then another question I ask myself is, what is the takeaway of the service? So what is the one sort of the point that the pastor is going to be landing on? And then what's the journey? So how are we going from entering into worship, and what are we taking with us as we go? And so that's sort of how I will frame up a service. And so, yeah, really a lot of what we do is weaving together the scripture text, the sermon, and then all the music and all the spoken words. So a lot of my planning too, I will do a lot of the speaking parts throughout the service as well, and just have it all tied together in that way.
Yeah, one of the things that I really appreciate about what Ellie does is that she does the theology herself on the text. And it's not just myself looking at it, but that conversation back and forth. Like even on a weekly basis, there's probably by Tuesday, I'm sitting down with Ellie and saying, here's where I think that sermon's going to go. Here's probably how I'm going to frame it up. Here's where I think it's going to land. And based on that, this is the song response I think I'd like to sing. And with that, sometimes Ellie will make suggestions for other songs, or I say it's kind of like this, or I think, and because she has such a good grasp of all the different music that could possibly fit with that kind of a theme, or where that's going to land, she's able to make other recommendations that I hadn't even considered. So I really, really appreciate that. I apologize, I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm kind of working with that too. So general principles for our working relationship, I just written down about 4 here. The first is always to work at the relationship. It is so important that the people that you work with, that you are not just taking them for granted. And I'm an introvert, so I like to go in my office and shut my door, but I know enough about working with staff that part of that is stepping out and having conversations, talking about the weather, or things that we saw, or things that we want to talk about, just the family life and all those kinds of things. And that's a work at that relationship that has to be intentional, has to be part of it. The second is Philippians chapter 2. And Philippians chapter 2 says, consider others better than yourself. And I think that's a daily discipline, to sit down and say, I don't have it all together. I'm not the one who's going to have all the great ideas and everything, but rather recognize that others are the ones that you're serving as a senior pastor. And I really, really try to work hard at fostering that for my own life. And then the third thing is, when there is conflict, to address it early and address it between the two of you. I don't recall any time that we had a real out and out conflict, but it is one of those things that in the course of ministry, there's going to come a time where you're going to be in conflict. And that's the kind of thing which, I set from the beginning, said, if we have a problem with each other, we need to talk about that. We need to address that with each other. rather than talking to our friends or our family or others that we think may be on our side and talk about each other. It's so important that we address that with each other early on. And that nips a lot of stuff in the bud, because most conflict, I find, begins in a misunderstanding. And when we can work those things out and explain those things, and if there's things that I need to own, then I own them. But if there's things I think somebody else needs to own, to say, this is my concern and this is what I think we need to work through. So that's the third. And then the last is laugh often, laugh much, and always keep your sense of humor intact. I think that's one thing. Even when we have staff meetings, sometimes we close the door, we have our staff meeting together, and sometimes there's people from the congregation that are walking by the room, and their comment is there's always laughter coming out of the staff meetings, and it's because we do nurture that, we do value that, and say that's important for us for a healthy relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another thing that we had talked about too is to publicly affirm the affirmable. And I think a lot of the time too, especially with how sort of church structure and staffing is developing over the years, a lot of congregations don't really understand the work that different people do in a staff. And especially coming in as a full-time worship person in a church where quite often it was done by volunteers and then it became part-time. It's sort of, well, why do we have somebody who works 40 hours a week? For them too to understand that these are the things that I do at the church, and that they can fully understand that as well. And I think that goes both ways, is to really, especially in front of others, to affirm the work that your coworkers are doing, and not taking credit for the things that you didn't do, but directing that to, oh, have you talked to Bob about that? Or you should tell him that you enjoyed that part, or something along those lines.
Can I just jump in for a minute? So just a comment to you as senior pastors. It is, and I know, and not only those that have staff, but also those that are solo pastors that are working with worship committee members. It is so important to publicly affirm the work that others are doing. It validates them, it encourages them, it makes them want to continue to contribute in ways that are productive and helpful. And when they know that you've got their back, they're willing to give that much more to the success of everything that's going around. And I really, really think others will praise you if you're doing your job well. But I think for the people that you work with, whether it's volunteer or staff, to publicly affirm them is so important.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing that we sort of talked about when we were planning or figuring out this presentation was that it seems that a lot of this planning works a lot better on a binary level, so with two people, rather than on a team level. So sort of where that expands, I guess, from these conversations, we'll have with the pastoral staff the big planning conversation of the macro. But then I take a lot of the micro planning, and that I will bring into more of that worship committee type style. So it almost becomes more like a pyramid scheme. In a good way. So it's not a bad one. So a lot of this big picture planning is one-on-one or 3-on-3. But from there, I think it is still helpful to have communal planning, because that keeps things fresh. It keeps different voices speaking into the conversation. So I'm not advocating for get rid of your worship committee and do all the work yourself, but to say, where are the places that we can do this with a full team, and where are the places that maybe this conversation is better had with just a small group of people, just to sort of keep that direction going and have things happen, but also to have those voices come in and speak to it.
Yeah, we do that even when it comes to a full service. So for instance, since my role is to be the one who preaches most regularly, then when Pastor Kevin steps in, his role is quite often definitely with the congregational prayer, and then either opening service or closing service. So like, for instance, this past Sunday, we wanted to get the congregational prayer exactly right. So Pastor Kevin and Pastor Ali worked together on that part of the service and said, okay, let's flesh this out. And then I'm kept in the loop by the emails. But in the end, it was the two of them that worked that out, because that was just appropriate, and that made for the most productive and effective work. But then when it comes to the sermon and How are we going to hit the right note in regards to the prayer after the sermon and the song response? Those are something that I have the conversation with Ellie and say, okay, how is this song going to fit in? Is this the best song that's going to fit in with that? So that's where it's just myself and Ellie, where Pastor Kevin's not part of that conversation. And that switches out when Pastor Kevin preaches that, then Pastor Kevin and Ellie work out those things, and then I'm the one that gets brought in on the congregational prayer.
Yeah, we wanted to also give just some examples of process and the ways that we've done a lot of this, just to give some hands-on applications. So then we were thinking a little bit about specific series that have come out of conversation, and we found that a lot of the time the big picture conversations actually occur at conferences. So attending conferences together is very helpful. We find for us that ends up being the Calvin Worship Symposium, partly because it's the proximity, but also it caters to both worship pastors and pastors, worship people and preachers. Lingo is hard. And so sometimes then after we've gone to different sessions, we'll share a little bit about what we learned and maybe something that could potentially work into a series or something. And again, it's just through these constant conversations. So one example we wanted to share was this last year, Lent, or 2 years? Anyway, 2 years ago, I think it was, for Lent. Bob had come up with this, a thought about doing the 7 deadly sins, and if there was a way that we could do that throughout the weeks of Lent. And I had the previous summer come off of a seminar at Calvin on Christian humility, and in that one somebody had recommended the book Glittering Vices by Rebecca Canine-Dyke DeYoung, in which she basically presents all of those 7 deadly sins, but defines them more as vices. And so through that conversation, we ended up using that book, as well as an art piece that we'd found, to bring this whole series together of Glittering Vices. And yeah, I think that worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the screen right now because I knew we were going to talk about this, but one person asked a question about reading a book and whether we do that as a planning team. And to be honest, we usually will talk to each other about books that we're reading and some insights that we're getting from that. But unless something is really coming in together for a certain series, we usually don't read the same books because of other different areas of expertise and different areas of our responsibilities in the church. So when it comes to like this book of Glittering Vices by Rebecca Canine-Dyke DeYoung, what was the neat thing about that was Ellie said, this is a great book. And then the rest of us got the book so that we could say, okay, as we're preparing for these sermons, we have this as a resource that we can work into, and we're all on the same page for that time. And for instance, now with what we're talking about with Fleming Rutledge's book on the crucifixion, it's a really heavy theological book, but is so rich in its imagery and the way it just communicates that it is something where I know Ellie well enough that that kind of theology interests her. So I might say, okay, here's a couple of pages. I'm going to loan you the book for the next day or so. This might be something you should want to read, so you get an understanding of the kind of theology that's forming and shaping the sermon that I'm going to be preaching in a few days. So that's some of that where it's not necessarily reading the same book, but at least sharing enough of that book that we're on the same page in regard to theology. And then we even talk about that in the hallway sometimes, just unpacking some of those things of saying, okay, are you more in favor of substitutionary atonement or Christus Victor, and which one do you cater to?
And yes, these are conversations we have had.
As sad as that may be for some of you hearing this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you want to also talk about the service? So sometimes with the service, as I'm working through a sermon, for instance, there was one that as I was reading it, it was really a focus on our sin, and that sermon really focused on how we need to hear from God that call for us to turn our lives around, repent, and be obedient to God. And the more I got into the sermon, the more it wasn't going to be something that landed in the later part of the service, but could actually be part of the service of reconciliation. So typically on a typical Sunday, we'll have some form of service of reconciliation, which is the call to confession, the prayer of confession, the assurance of pardon, and then the call to discipleship. Usually the call to discipleship we put at the end of the service. But this time when we put it together, I started talking to Ellie and I said, it really feels as though this sermon is actually a call to confession. And so we started brainstorming and saying, okay, how are we going to frame that up? How are we going to do that? And if we now put the sermon as part of that service of reconciliation, then how do we frame up the rest of the service? Where does the congregational prayer go? Where does the assurance of pardon go? The offering, and we will play with services like that, so that we're not conditioned that we have to do it every week the exact same way, but to say we're going to play with it a little bit different. And we don't do that often, maybe once in every 6 weeks or so, I would say. But it's something which the congregation does give us permission to do that. And some of that is letting them experience that and saying, okay, this fits. This really helps them to express and understand that, yeah, that fits exactly as that call to confession. So I know some say, well, the sermon is the central part of the service. We look at the whole service, that every part of it in one way or another adds to hammer home and bring together this single theme of this is what we're trying to communicate in that worship time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sort of that this whole service is working towards the same goal, and framing it up that way.
Yeah. So that's about a half hour.
Takes a question. I think also just on the topic of books, and I think part of this comes out of having a healthy relationship and an open communication, but just being willing to share your excitement of something that you've been reading, and also as the other person, whether it's something that you're interested in or not, to share in that excitement with the person who's sharing with you. So maybe I got a book recently on music and theology and their interaction with each other, and I thought this was the greatest thing. And Bob was not super stoked about it, but he was excited that I was excited about it and was wanting to share about those things. So I think also in that working relationship, just to be open to listening to each other and also being open to share about your excitement as well. It goes both ways. So yeah, I think we turn it over to Diane for some questions.
Yep.
All right, great. Thank you. Well, that was really, really good. Thank you so much for all of the principles and the examples that you shared. We have several questions. I also have one just to kind of continue the conversation that you've been having about working together, and we can tell that you have fun. We see the laughter even in your presentation, and on your faces the joy. So that's really fun. And we've actually, I should tell our audience, we've asked you, to sit nice and close together so you both fit in the screen there. My question though here is, we're obviously a female and a male, or a man and a woman working together to plan worship. And like you said, often, two people will work through a service. So how do you do that in a healthy way? Do you have any boundaries? Do you have any rules? Are there any things that you follow, to protect yourselves in that?
Well, my personal rule is, if you want to ask me to lead in prayer, I need a half an hour to get my head shaped around. If you want me to preach, I need at least a day to prepare a sermon. If you want to hug me, I want a week's notice. So, and that's part of the joke, but it's also something which says keeping those boundaries very clear and very respectful, and saying we are here together as professionals. There's usually 4 or 5 of us in the building at any time. The male-female thing, I think it's about those kind of boundaries, to say if I'm going to work with someone, there's a lot of that kinds of language. It's a lot about the way the conversation is shaped and tinged. I'm very careful about how I speak to female staff in a way that respects them and honors them. And I don't know if that's been your experience.
Yeah, I think also we have very open conversations about just the dangers and the issues that are present in the church in working relationships and even just in the male-female interactions. And so I think that open honesty as well has created a space for feeling of safety, if that makes sense. And that we're not, the boundaries are set up that are in place.
One of the things when I started on staff here, there was 2 women that were already working here, and I basically had with each one a conversation. And one of the things I made very clear is if I have said or done anything that has made you feel uncomfortable, you need to let me know, because maybe I'm not aware of that has made you uncomfortable. And I've said that if you feel in some way or other that you cannot talk to me about it, you need to go to the council chair to talk about that. And there are different times when things come up in our area or in the news or whatever, we will reiterate that conversation to say we're seeing this in our culture. I mean, the whole #MeToo thing gave rise for us to have that conversation again and say, we need to be clear about these boundaries and what's proper and what's God honoring.
Thank you for addressing that, and so honestly too. We do have, I'll let our watchers and listeners know that we do have a list of resources that Bob and Ellie have recommended, and we're going to put those up at the end. We will also put those up when we post this, the recording of this webinar, with links to where you can find these resources or these books. And those books are going to be things that discuss or are written about working together as a team, right, to plan worship and in ministry. And there's one that Bob joked and sent in that we took out. It was Everything Men Know About Women by Not Much. And he has a copy of it there, but we decided that was not really.
I didn't realize that he wrote it.
Yeah, his name was Not Much. So this is a book. It's pretty thick. I got it from my mother-in-law for Christmas one year, and it's all blank pages.
So yes, it's a joke. Sorry. So please send your questions in too. We have a few to get started with here, but please keep sending in your questions for Bob and Ellie. This is the time to ask them.
Can we ask, or can we talk about some of those resources?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead and talk about the resources while people send some more questions in.
Yeah, because I think one that you mentioned was Strength Finders.
Yes.
Which I think is important to touch on. So, and this also goes back to the question about if we've done books together as a team. So one thing that we all have done is the Strengths Finder test to find out what your strengths are. And one of the things that we're looking to work into as well is how do you then, with knowing your strengths, how do you work with the others that are on staff with you in learning to recognize those strengths, but also to work well with each other's weaknesses too.
Yep.
And so knowing where your strengths lie and also knowing where your colleagues' strengths lie, I think is helpful to have. So that was one thing we found useful. One of the books that I recommended was called Designing Worship Together. And that's by Norma Dewall-Malafite and Howard Vanderwell. And that actually, it goes in a lot into service review and planning teams. But the first chapter, I think, is really speaks to this working relationship between staff and pastor. And it gives a lot of good principles for working together and having that communication. So some of what we talked about too is touched on in that book. So that was one I wanted to highlight.
Yeah, and the other one that I wanted to highlight was the ministry staff member. And it's really written for people that are on staff about how do they interact and how do they find their place in a staff ministry. But I really think it's important for senior pastors or lead pastors to read as well, to get an understanding of how others can feel as though their contributions are considered less. Because usually when there's praise, it goes to the senior pastor, and when there's complaints, it goes to the senior pastor. And those are things where understanding how your staff members may feel in the middle of that. Like I know for myself, if there's a great service, I get 15 compliments on it. And each time it's kind of like, have you told Ellie about that, because she's put all the effort into this. And I'm very intentional about doing that because I see how much work others put into the whole.
Great, thank you. We're going to start with a question from Sydney. She sent this in pretty early there. So we'll address that one first. What do you think are the fundamental differences between pastors and worship leaders that cause the greatest challenges in the working relationship, generally speaking?
I think a lot of it has to do with power. Often the pastor has significant power because of this at least in Christian Reformed Church circles, the sermon is the central part of the service. That's often repeated, and I think it says that everything has to revolve around that. I think that's one aspect of it. And the senior pastor is often the one that's looked to as, or the preaching pastor, solo pastor, is the one's looked to give leadership and guidance and direction on that. I think that's one. I think another part of it is, I'm just going to let that go. I'm going to let you jump in here.
Fill in a few. I'm quickly writing notes. One big one would be training, I think. So a lot of the time your pastors are going to be trained a lot in the theology end of things, but not necessarily in worship or in music. And then your musicians will be trained more in the music and performance end of things, but maybe not necessarily as much in theology. And so you're coming at it from very different angles, and you really, I think both are very passionate about the angle that they're coming at it from. So understanding that your education is different, and yet there's ways that those gaps get bridged. The other one would be an issue of pride, I think. For me, it was a reframing of my thinking pattern, because for me, when I would come out of a worship service, a lot of the things that would stick with me were the songs, because that's the language that I'm more attuned to speaking. So in a service, it might be a piece of music that spoke to me more than what I would maybe get out of the sermon. And not everybody's like that either. So learning that just because that's the way I'm wired is not necessarily the way that everyone else is wired. And so part of that too is putting aside that pride of my part is the important part of the service. And that goes for both sides. That I may see maybe that the music is this is where it's going to speak to people's hearts. But the pastor is going to say no, my part is what's going to really, really hammer that home. So putting aside that pride and knowing that it'll be God that speaks to the people's hearts, and that he'll use whatever medium that is there. So.
Yeah, and this kind of does get into the second thing I was going to say, because, and I think Ellie's nailed it just right, but I do want to add this. I really think you need to discipline yourself to learn each other's language. And for ministers, I can't say this for everyone, but I know I want to get my theology right. And when I'm able to have a good theological discussion with Ellie about it, it really helps. And sometimes that may be that I have to explain a concept which rarely happens with Ellie. But it's the other side of it of saying I need to learn to appreciate, even this past Sunday, the service that we had, how Ellie's offertory just pulled everything together that had been happening up to that point. The prayer of God's people and the sermon, and how that just was the capstone that pulled it all together and really, really spoke to the congregation. And that's something where that appreciation for each other is so important.
Yeah, thank you. Rachel is asking, how far ahead of a single service is your detailed planning typically taking place?
So I think I would prefer it if I had it more advanced planning, but typically I'll have the details are planned by the Wednesday before the Sunday. And that's partly because that's when my rehearsal night usually is with the bands. And so generally by that point, my T's need to be crossed and my I's need to be dotted. Ideally, I don't know if that's necessarily the ideal for most people. I'm also a bit of a procrastinator, so that is what works for me, is that this is the deadline, this is what I need to be planned. But I think we're both kind of like that. So for us, it not really, no. Yeah, you are. In a way, yeah, I think our timeline, it works for us, but I'm not suggesting that that's the way that it should work for everybody. But yeah.
Yeah, so basically what happens is, for me, Monday and Tuesday is typically the days in the week where I'm doing my reading. I've got my text ready. I know what I'm going to be preaching on. I'm reading commentaries, and the ideas are beginning to percolate for me. And so already by the end of Tuesday, I got a kind of an idea of which direction the sermon's going to go and how it's going to land. And so that's where I'm able to turn to Ellie and say, I think the sermon's going to go here, and that's how it's going to come together. The broader theme of knowing that it's on this particular text, Ellie has weeks in advance, so she can work on that in those weeks, or allow those things to kind of percolate over a few days or a few weeks, I should say, in advance of the actual week of when we're going to have that service. I know pastors that write sermons 4 weeks in advance. I can't do that. And some of that is my personality, where I keep needing input. And that input of all those things that happen in the week, it's not so much, and that's why I kind of shook my head with about the procrastination. It's not so much that I'm procrastinating and leaving the work to the last minute. It's my personality says, once I've got everything I could possibly pull in, now I can write. And so it might take me 2 to 3 hours to actually write the whole sermon. But it's been the whole week of input and wrestling with and allowing that text itself to work in my being to get it exactly the way it should be. But
so Ellie, you said that you have your rehearsals on Wednesday night then. So is that the first time the musicians see the music? I'm just going to ask a musician question because I understand all these dynamics. And is that when your musicians are able to get the music and then get it ready for a service on Sunday?
Yeah, in my context, that is how it's been working here. And again, it's partly because, well, I should put it this way. If we're introducing a new song, that may be brought into rehearsals earlier on in the process, just because this is something I've been thinking about including at some point. So I should say too, the larger, there are detailed plans that are taking place a good month in advance of services. Like I'll have a bit of a framework of where Lent might go in January, but the detail of fine tuning doesn't happen till the week before. But otherwise, if I have certain songs that I want to introduce, we might start working on that a few weeks before. But typically, I don't introduce too many new ones at a time. And my musicians are pretty used to, they get their music on Wednesday, they'll take it home with them. And then by Sunday, we're ready to go. So yeah, that is the first time that they see it. And again, it will depend on the musician sometimes too. Some of them keep me a little bit more on my toes, that I might need to be planned a little bit more in advance. And then give them the music ahead of time for rehearsal. So that depends as well on who I have, but.
Sure, and it's knowing your people too that you're working with, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Leon is asking, we'll keep going here because we do have a few more questions, and I'm going to encourage people still to send in their questions because we do have time yet to keep going here for about 10 or 15 more minutes. Leon is asking, he says, I appreciate our worship planners and leaders. They do a good job planning individual worship services and implementing them. However, I find that they don't seem too interested in collaborating with me, and I assume Leon is the pastor, on developing larger sermon or worship series. So accordingly, are there any baby steps that you would suggest in terms of advancing a spirit of collaboration? Good question. Yeah. All of these are good questions.
Wow, Leon, I'm really impressed in the quality of the question you're asking. What's the next one? I think that spirit of collaboration really begins in humility. That I mean that's why I put that core of Philippians 2, and trying to find ways to affirm and encourage the ideas of others. And I think that really calls for, sometimes we may have an idea of saying this is exactly what's going to work. And sometimes letting a service fall flat and learning through that and saying, so what went well and what needed improvement? And I think even if there's an idea that others with you that didn't quite go as well as it could, and you're thinking, oh, shoot, this is going to fail. Part of that is doing the debrief with your staff afterwards or with your worship team afterwards. They themselves know what went wrong. They know how it went wrong. And part of that is saying, so what should we be doing differently, and allowing them to wrestle through that rather than trying to protect it. My comment is always, people are not going to lose their faith based on one service. It may not have been the most enjoyable, or there may have been some gaffes along the way. So be it. God will work through that as well. But that learning and helping them along and encouraging them, I think, is huge in regards to that collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tricky question, though, because if you're in a situation where people maybe don't even want to really contribute, or it sounds like they're not too interested in the contributing to the conversation of the larger picture. I almost wonder if throwing you guys decide on what my next series is going to be, and throwing that at your planners and leaders and letting them just figure it out, and then present it to you if we think that this would be a good series for you to do, to at least give them a moment of very strong empowerment, and then to see that, oh, this actually can work really well if we were to collaborate on something, as opposed to either top down or bottom up decision making. Maybe that's not a baby step. That might be a big giant leap of faith, but yeah, I don't know if maybe just opening up that opportunity for people to really be creative, and to come up with something, and then see it through to its fruition, then to reevaluate and look back and say, okay, well, what worked for you in this, what didn't work, and to evaluate on that. One other thing that we had talked about too in putting this thing together was that quite often you'll enter into a conversation of collaboration where somebody already has an agenda or a fully formed idea of what they're wanting to get across. I've had services I've planned with other pastors. I won't throw you under the bus. Where as soon as you've entered into the conversation, you know that they already have the service planned. And then I wonder, well, what am I doing here? Am I your secretary to write this down, or am I actually contributing to the conversation? And that takes a lot of vulnerability too, to show up and be like, you know what, I don't really have an idea, or maybe I have a few that aren't fully formed, and to just have that conversation.
Yeah, I think a big part, even with the collaboration, to explain to these your worship team or your staff, this is the process I go through. This is where I begin. So when I begin thinking, like for me, and I'll be honest about this, sometimes there's things that just spark at worship symposium, and I make notes saying, oh, this would be a great thing. Like I already said to Ellie, this is how I want to do our New Year's Eve and New Year's Day service. I mean, that was one of the big things we talked about at symposium. And that's where Ellie turns to me and she goes, do you have this written down somewhere? But it's those idea generator places. But that's part of it, communicating to others and saying, this is how I come up with these ideas. These are the books I'm reading, or these are the resources I'm using. It doesn't all come from my head. There's constantly others that I'm relying on, and making those available to them and saying, these are the resources that have helped me to figure things out. How about you guys? And I like Ellie's comment. How about you guys have a go at it and plan out this series? And I will find a way to fit into that series in a way that honors what your contribution is.
Great. Thank you. We do have a question here from Trish. She says, our worship planning team includes our pastor and 2 volunteers. We incorporate your principles and methods, which is heartening. Sometimes it's just good to attend these things so you can be affirmed, right? It works for us and is a real blessing to us as planners. But how can we train others to be involved, to avoid burnout?
I would say switch out one of your volunteers. So, because if what I'm seeing here is that your pastor and 2 volunteers, I would, when I was doing this with one church where we had a worship team, where there was, 7 or 8 people in the worship team. So every time that we were planning out a specific service or series, I would work with 2 different people. So, and that way I could do that role. And that part of that is my strongest spiritual gift is teaching. So I would be able to explain to them, these are the kinds of things that I work with. These are the resources you have. This is how to use the resources that are there. But I would think if you're using 2 volunteers, the way that you can train others is one of those volunteers steps out and somebody else steps into that place. And so you've got 2 that understand and 1 that becomes new and is picking it up along the way.
And even that can develop into a rotation. So maybe then you'll end up with, say, 4 volunteers that all kind of get it, and then you work with 2 at a time. And so maybe they'll plan 1 or 2 services for a month, and then it ends up being less of the weekly regularity. But yeah, the avoiding burnout is a big question for churches, I think, and just volunteerism in general. So
it is, isn't it? And, Sunday, for all of us who have planned worship, Sunday comes some people would say every other day almost, especially if you're planning more than 1 service a week. So you 2 are both blessed and fortunate to be full-time, obviously, ministers in your church. How do you avoid burnout, even with a full-time job or employment, I guess I should say? How do you avoid burnout when Sunday comes every week?
I think for me, it's being very intentional about having a Sabbath, and finding that space, and you have to figure out which day is going to work for you. For me, Saturday is sort of my day, where it just helps me to be refreshed before jumping in on Sunday morning again. And I notice it now that if I have we had a funeral on Saturday, and I really felt that I lost my full Sabbath. And so then I feel a bit more worn down the following week. So yeah, I find really be specific about this is the time that I set apart, and make sure you guard that time as well as much as possible. You're going to have things that come into it, but yeah, make sure to create an isolated space, and then to not look at emails on those times, or not even enter into those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, rhythm is so important in regard to your spiritual life. Are you able to step back from things? I have established good boundaries from the get-go, and that is part of my personality, to be very clear about what I'm responsible for and what I'm not responsible for. But that weekly rhythm of saying I've got to step away from everything. It was like 10 o'clock at night, and something had come up in my mind, so I sent an email off to our administrator assistant, and 10 minutes later, she sends me an email back, and that's when the next morning I came in. I said, we need to have a conversation. You are not on the clock at 10 o'clock at night. It may have been something that was on my mind, and I just needed to clear my mind, so I sent an email. But that's something which I expect you to deal with the next day when you come into work, not that late at night that you're watching for these kinds of things. And that was important to me, because I feel that my leadership of saying, yeah, I'm taking a day off, is important to also expect that from others, to say, I'm not expecting you to be on the clock 24/7. I expect you to take time for your family and time for yourself. And when the work, especially something that's not urgent, leave it alone. We'll get to it on Monday morning or whenever.
Good. If anybody else has a question, you may type it in fairly quickly here. We have a few more minutes. I do have a question. When you talked, Bob, about those principles, the first one was to work at relationships. I'm just wondering how you do that with your staff. Do you have retreats? Do you have weekly meetings, monthly gatherings? How do you work on the relationships in your church, in your staff, I should say?
So there's a number of things. Number one is we do have weekly meetings. So every Tuesday at 11 o'clock, and we do Tuesday because Pastor Kevin takes Mondays off. And that's something which we said, okay, we're going to respect that. And Tuesday, that's when we really need to make sure we're all aligned to what everybody needs. That's one thing. The second thing is, and I have to say that from my side, because I'm an introvert, I'm glad to go in my office and shut my door, and I do. But I also am disciplined that if there's an email that comes to me that someone's wondering about something, I might be in the middle of working something. As soon as I finish working on that, I will get up out of my office and I'll go to their office, knock on the door and say, can we talk? And they're usually pretty good about that. And we'll have that face-to-face conversation. So what that does is it continues to to build the connections. But also, I mean, those times in the kitchen when everyone's getting a coffee or at the same time, or warming up lunch, whatever it may be, to talk about the things that are going on in their life and show interest in them. And probably the other big thing that we really do is I have a hospitality allowance, and I burn through that hospitality allowance on taking staff out for lunch. There's other things that I do with pastoral care, but that usually comes out of my own pocket because to me it's so important to make sure that my staff have those times of just being together in a social setting. So the sign will be on the door. We'll be back in an hour and a half. Whenever you've read that, and an hour, and we'll go out for a lunch. And it might be a $60 bill for the 5 of us to go out, or it might be a $100 bill for the 5 of us to go out. But it's just to sit down and just socialize.
Good. Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm going to try to share my screen here again, and we don't have any other questions. I want to put up the resources that we have, and if you can see those, we have the Designing Worship Together, the Vital Worship, Healthy Congregations by Norma Dual, Malafite, and Howard Vanderwell that Ellie mentioned a little while ago. We have the ministry staff member, and that's the one that Bob mentioned. That was good for lead pastors to read. Neither one of you mentioned the next one, the Entree Leadership by Dave Ramsey. Does somebody do either one of you want to describe why you put that on the list?
Yeah, I'm the one to put that on the list, and it's just Dave Ramsey talking about working with other staff. It's just some basic good principles. Chapter 22 is the one that really gets specifically into that, and I'm sure you can even download that from online or wherever. I don't know.
Okay, sounds good. When I put these onto the network or onto our website post, I'll put a link to each where you can find and purchase each one of these resources. And then we have the Strengths Finder on the bottom. And just one of you, I think you did mention this one a little bit. I know we've used this one here too for our staff. Do you want to say just a little bit more about why that has been helpful to you?
Yeah, Ellie mentioned that already in the seminar or webinar. From my perspective, it just helps me to understand the people that are working around me and how I can rely on them.
Yeah.
It's helpful too to know how other people are wired, because quite often, at least for me, I think that other people think the same way that I do. And so I'd also suggest Strength Finders. You can also you can find coaches that will help you walk you through it. And I met with a coach recently, and one of the things that I said to her was, I never realized that other people don't just enter into a room and want to meet everybody. I'm very extroverted and social, and so a stranger is just a friend I haven't met yet. But it took a bit for me to realize that not everybody's really wired that way, and that some people get overwhelmed in those situations. And so understanding that about your coworkers, I think is really helpful too, to know that they may not even be voicing the anxiety that they have, but this helps us to better understand what could be present inside of them. The other one that we have actually done a book together as staff, and that was Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And I think with that one, it was less about the practical working together as far as what the outcomes are going to be, but it was more about that relational aspect of things, and knowing ourselves and then better knowing each other. And I think the vulnerability that created in the room was really helpful for us just to build those relationships. So yeah, that was, I think that's what, Scazzaro or something.
Yep, Scazzaro.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. And if you want to send me that one, maybe I could just include that in the post too, that you've mentioned it now in the webinar. So thank you both so much. It is time that we wrap this up, 2 o'clock. So we're so grateful for you and for your vulnerability in sharing with us your experiences, but also your wisdom and your advice. And we are extremely grateful. You will notice on this last slide too, that if anybody out there wants to worship or to email us at Worship Ministries Office, our email is up there, worship@crcna.org. It's really easy. or and visit our website again too at crcna.org/worship. So thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to more webinars in March. Check out the website on that and sign up for them. And thank you again, Bob and Ellie, for all of your contributions to this. And we will say goodbye. Thanks.
Thanks.